morning, everyone. Today is May 18th, 2023, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project, founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motin in the spring of 2020. Every Thursday, Jean Lawler and I are delighted to host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everyone who negotiates. As you know, there's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And one of the favorite parts for all of us of the webinar each week is when we announce the running total of just how much our generous audiences have contributed to fight food insecurity around the world in honor of our great speakers. Jean Lawler, would you please do the honors?
With pleasure. We are so close to $400,000. This will maybe be the week that puts it over. The amount of donations about which we have been told, and I always put that asterisk on it because I'm sure there have been more, but $398,217.92. Amazing.
Wow. Fantastic, fantastic. And today we have another tremendous presentation on the Metaverse, stable diffusion, AI, and deepfakes. Well, we're all going to find out together exactly what that means and how it relates to us. We have two terrific speakers today, Heather Meeker and Ken Correa. Heather Meeker is a founding portfolio partner at OSS Capital, an early-stage venture capital fund specializing in commercial open source development. She was formerly a partner at O'Melveny & Myers in the Silicon Valley office in the Mergers and Acquisitions Practice Group. Heather advises technology clients on IP matters, including licensing and collaboration arrangements, software copyright and patent issues, technology procurement, open source licensing strategies, and IP issues in investments, mergers, and acquisitions. She is an internationally known specialist in open source software licensing. Her latest book, Open Source for Business, is the definitive handbook for lawyers, engineers, and business executives on open source licensing in business. Another book, Technology Licensing, a Primer, is a widely used handbook for technology licensing specialists. Ken Correa. Ken is a technology transactions attorney, arbitrator, and mediator with 30 years of experience in IP licensing, litigation, and technology transactions. He practiced at leading U.S. law firms and served as senior vice president at Samsung Electronics as head of the Silicon Valley IP office from 2011 to 2021. Ken has handled more than 200 IP litigation matters, negotiated numerous patent licenses, including 3 of the largest patent cross-license agreements, and helped clients to acquire companies ranging from startups to the multi-billions of dollars. He currently serves as an arbitrator for the AAA, FINRA, and the Korean Commercial Arbitration Board International, and as a neutral for the World Intellectual Property Organization Arbitration and Mediation Center. Heather and Ken, please tell us a little bit about the food banks to which you would like people to contribute if they're in a position to do so. And then on with the presentation. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Correa. As introduced, I'm an attorney, arbitrator, and mediator. I practice most of my 30 years in the tech space as a litigator, transactions attorney, and in-house counsel. As a result, I have a deep appreciation and fascination for technology. To me, technology is like a perpetual child. It keeps growing. It keeps evolving. It does cool things, but meanwhile, it also creates new issues while it is doing cool things. So that's what we are going to talk about today, a subset of generative AI known as stable diffusion and probably ChatGPT, its sister, with the 2 of my good friends. I have to tell you that this AI field is a fascinating one because the very first project I worked on after engineering school, before I went to law school, was a AI project. I had to maintain and further develop an expert system that my then company developed for its tools. Ultimately, we decided to scrap the project because we did not have computing power to make it really work. But it turned out to be, it was not the first, but the second time that AI was in the forefront of the technology. I think first time was back in late 50s and late 50s and early 60s. It fizzled out, and then it fizzled out again in 80s. And then now we are dealing with the third time that AI is on the cutting edge of technology. But this time it feels different. We have sufficient computing power. Looks like AI has become very easy to use, and it is making differences. It is impacting our lives these days. So I am super excited to discuss this with two of my good friends. And we are going to talk about what it is, what kind of cool things it does, what kind of issues it creates, and ultimately what we as ADR professionals, as arbitrators, mediators, ombuds, can do something about the disputes it may or has already created. So I know Heather has been already introduced, but Heather and I go way back. We were law firm partners at Greenberg Traurig about 20 years ago. We were young back then, but Heather was already one of the top open source attorneys in the tech space. I think the other guy retired, so you can take it from me. I think Mark retired, so she is the top. She also
I dispute that he was ever the top, but okay.
Well, he is also over the top. Nice guy, but he's over the top. Anyway, she practiced at top law firms in Silicon Valley, such as Wilson Sonsini, Greenberg Traurig, and O'Melveny, where she was the head of global tech licensing practice. She has her own practice now, and then she is also a venture capitalist in, you guessed it, in the AI space. The other gentleman that we forgot to introduce is Colin Rule, and Colin needs no introduction. If you are in the ADR space and you don't know Colin, you just haven't practiced long enough. Colin is one of the pioneers in online dispute resolution. In fact, when he was at eBay, he designed their very first online dispute resolution program. He runs arbitrate.com, mediate.com, as well as odr.com. Here are a couple fun facts. Colin and I are essentially neighbors in Los Gatos, California area. And Colin was also a Peace Corps volunteer before he started working in the ADR space. So I think many of us heard about Metaverse before. And to me, that's a couple of years ago when Facebook changed its name to Meta. I was thinking, what is Meta? And then I think that's when I got really interested in Metaverse. But I don't think many of us have heard about stable diffusion. In fact, the first time I heard about stable diffusion was a year ago from Heather. So Heather, I was really fascinated by what he had to say, and I was excited about what it can do, but I was concerned about what it might do. So why don't you tell us what stable diffusion is?
Thanks very much, Ken. Yeah, so you might be wondering, why is a person who is characterized as an open expert, even open source expert, talking about this issue? And by the way, the answer to that is that the legal issues with this technology are so new, and people have so many questions about it that starting maybe in February or March of this year, I have gotten literally more questions about generative AI than open source, which is really saying something, since before that I had declared my practice to be 100% open source related. The only reason I ended up fielding those questions was that I had previously worked on a case called Oracle v. Google, which started out as a open source case and ended up being about pure software copyright. So as a result, I got, very involved in pure software copyright issues. And it turns out that a lot of the questions around generative AI are copyright questions. And so that's why I'm here talking today about it and why I've been tracking this. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this technology is. And bear with me because this is not strictly speaking about the law, but I find, as with many technology and legal issues, what you read in the press can be very confusing and misleading because the facts get glossed over. And so people, I think, misunderstand a little bit what this technology is, and they start thinking it's something it's not, and that causes them to come to, shall we say, questionable conclusions about how the law applies to it. I should also preface this by saying that what I say about the law in this area is my own opinion because it is rapidly developing, and this is a place where the law has a lot of work to do keeping up with the technology. So let's talk about machine learning. People use the term artificial intelligence, or AI, and machine learning, or ML, pretty much interchangeably. I won't bother trying to really distinguish the two because I'm not sure there's any accepted distinction really in the definition. But as Ken mentioned, AI has been around for a long time. And Ken, like you, I worked on AI projects even before I was a lawyer, when I was a computer programmer before I was a lawyer. And so this would have been in the late 1980s. I was working on some AI projects, but they looked very different. And that is in part because we did not have the computing firepower to do what people are doing today. But so artificial intelligence is really anything that mimics human interaction, particularly language. A lot of it focuses on language. And so we've all used artificial intelligence, say chatbots, when you do customer support, here, chat with, ask a question of our automated system. You ask a question and maybe it'll give you 3 or 4 answers and say, did this answer your question? That is artificial intelligence, but it's probably not machine learning. By the way, that's why you get so frustrated with it and type in things like, you have a stupid chatbot and I don't want to talk to it anymore. If you're a person like me, which I hope you're not. But so what they're doing is they're looking for keywords and trying to kind of do sort of a search and match against something that has been written by humans, and then it picks out answers to present to you. So that's artificial intelligence, and that's been around forever. Artificial intelligence also can be predictive, like you take in a lot of data about, say, what happens when people who have a certain medical condition take a certain pharmaceutical, and then you predict who is going to do better on this particular pharmaceutical based on a bunch of data that you collect. So that has also been around forever. And if you roll back the clock 3 years or 4 years before the pandemic, a lot of my clients were working on that, and that was called AI, and it was very hot. But what we call AI now, and what all the furor is about, is machine learning, and particularly what we call generative AI. So first, what's machine learning? Machine learning is, they call it a model or a construct. So it's not exactly software. What it is it's a big array of probabilities, and you'll feed input into it, and it will say, okay, the highest probability is that if I get this input, I have to go in this direction. and then this direction and this direction. It goes into this big, basically kind of decision tree, and it comes out with an output. When you create a model like that, you first assign all the probabilities random values, and then you take input, which is sometimes called training data, and you put it into the model, you see what comes out, and then you give feedback on whether it got it right. And the model actually learns as you train the model. That's sometimes called heuristic model. So that model can be used to create things that would ordinarily be subject to copyright protection. So things that humans normally create, and the copyright law was designed to cover. For instance, texts like books or articles, music, artwork, you name it, an AI can produce it. But what has been lacking until this time, as Ken said, was the massive computing power required to train these models, and also massive amounts of data. If you go back even 10 or 15 years, we didn't have the amount of data online to train these models, much less the computing power. By the way, I should say that massive amounts of data will probably always be required, but the computing power is going to go down soon. And what we have today is a situation where it takes a lot of money and resources to train these models, but that's going to get easier very soon because the technology is changing rapidly. So that's what a machine learning model is. It's important to understand a couple of concepts about this. First, the models don't actually contain the input data. What they have is a bunch of probabilities based on different decisions that they're going to make. So if the model is trained on, say, a book, and the book has, the model identifies certain meaning in the book, and then it says, if you get a word like this, you should go next to a word like this, or if you get a sentence like this, you should go to a sentence like this. It doesn't actually contain the original material. What it's done is it has created the probabilities based on lots and lots of materials. And if you train the model correctly, all of the input data kind of fuses together into the model into a series of probabilities. So you wouldn't look at the model and say, oh, there's this article. In fact, that leads us to the second concept that's important, and that is that these things at this point are black boxes, meaning if you get certain output out of the model, you cannot tell how it got there because you trained it and it assigned some probabilities, but that's not something that humans did. It's not like the old chatbots that had a decision tree that was written by people. It is a model that has sort of made itself learn what to do next, and it can be, and it's impossible at this point to tell how it got from A to B. In fact, that's a big issue for a lot of other reasons that I'm not going to talk about today, but I have previously worked on matters about how using AI in, say, decisions about finance, healthcare, things that are important to people's lives can be very challenging because you can't tell whether the model has been trained not to create a discriminatory output. That's actually a huge issue in AI and machine learning. So those are the basic ideas about what machine learning is. And by the way, I have a link, which I hope there's chat here. So I'm going to put this in the chat. And if you're interested in learning more about what this technology is, that link was pretty good explanation that I found when I was just casting around. It happens to be published by a company that does AI, but I thought it was a pretty good explanation.
By the way, if you have any questions or comments, please use chat box. We'll look at it and we'll probably address them toward the end, but we might be able to, sometimes we might be able to deal with them on the fly. So Heather, so we have generative AI. So So you're going to get to the stable diffusion and ChatGPT, which is a form of generative AI, right?
Right. That's where we're going next. So this category of generative AI has burst on the scene really just in 2023. And it's come about so fast because the GPUs, like the chips, the processors needed to train these models, you need a lot of them, and it's very expensive. So you're going to find when I talk about these things that most of them are created by very large companies or institutions. And that's why it takes a lot of resources to do this. So let's talk about stable diffusion first. Okay, that is a generative AI model that was released in late 2022, and it's used to generate artwork images. If you haven't tried this, I suggest you try it because there's no better way to understand the technology than to actually, use it and see what it's like. You can try it for free. By the way, there is a website called Hugging Face, which has, it's a repository for some AI stuff, and you can go there and try different things if you want to just check out what some of this stuff is. But the idea is you would put in a description like a snowman toasting marshmallows over a fire, and it would present to you some images of snowmen toasting marshmallows over a fire that it has created based on being trained on millions of images. So it's creating kind of a generic snowman roasting marshmallows over a fire. You can also tell it things like snowman roasting marshmallows on the fire in the style of Picasso, and it will do what it thinks it should do based on your prompt. And you can then refine your prompts and see if you can get an output that you like out of it. Those stable diffusion was created by a startup called Stability AI. Full disclosure, my fund actually has a small position in that company. So, consider the source. But it developed it in collaboration with some nonprofit organizations. So that was developed with private money and some public institutions. It is what we would roughly call an open source AI, meaning that its model weights and its software code used to train it has been released publicly. Next, I will note something called DALL-E. Obviously, that's a pun on the artist Dolly, but that's also an image generation AI, and that's done by a company called OpenAI. Now, OpenAI is a private company, and I don't want you to be misled. The things that they release are not open at all. They're not open source. They're completely proprietary, unlike Stable Diffusion, which releases a lot of its stuff open source. DALL-E uses a version of GPT-3, which is a machine learning model tool, and it's been modified to generate images. And you can get that online, but I believe I think you can try it out for free, but it runs behind the servers of OpenAI, and you can't look at the code for it. There's something called Midjourney. That is a similar kind of image generation AI, but that is created by an independent research laboratory, called Midjourney in San Francisco. So those are the image generation AIs. And I'll note at this point a term called deepfakes. And you've probably heard of this, and it doesn't always apply just to images, but one of the consequences of using AI in this way is that you can actually create images that never existed in the real world. And recently you might have seen a picture of the Pope in a puffy winter jacket. That was not real. I mean, obviously some parts of it were created from some real things. But the point is that a deepfake is something where somebody has altered media like images or sound that in in a way that is supposed to present them as real, and they are indistinguishable from the real thing. There was people have released some amazing things, some fake podcasts, interviews, pictures, etc. So we are moving into a time where we see media and we will not know whether it's real or not. And that's an issue we have to deal with as a society. How will people trust the images and media that they see anymore? Okay, I'm going on to the large language models like ChatGPT. I'm sure you've read about this in the press. That is a machine learning model, and it creates basically text. So I would call that a chatbot. You put in a question and it gives you an answer. And again, you should try using these things if you can, because some of the output that it presents is really quite good. It's obviously not perfect. You've probably read about mistakes it's made, or things that it has said that people have taken issue with. But I would point out that for basic expository prose, it's probably better than most of the associates I've trained. Sorry. So it produces very competent basic expository prose. And in fact, personally, I have used it in order to do like help with first drafts of things I'm writing, just because it spits something out and then I can edit it, much like, I would work with an associate I was training. In this case, I'm kind of quote unquote training the AI to assist me with writing. Now, there's also Llama, which was released by Facebook. You might wonder why Facebook would be releasing a large language model, since it's in the business mainly of social media. But the fact is that everybody in Silicon Valley is working on these things now. It's kind of like 5 years ago, everyone was working on autonomous vehicles, whether they were car companies or anything or not. Now they're all working on large language models. These all work pretty much the same way. You put in a prompt and you get some response, and then you can put in a follow-on prompt and get additional responses that might be a little bit more narrowly focused. I mentioned a couple of things before I start talking at you. One is that you can also have these kinds of models for music, and Google created one called Music LM. I think that stands for large model, I'm not sure, but it will generate music from prompts. So you can say something like, I'd like something that's kind of eerie sounding, but in using oboes or something like that, and it will generate music that meets a description. And some of it's really not too bad. That is much more experimental. It was based on more like an academic project. So this stuff is already here for music, already here for artwork, already here for text. And a very important subset of the text generation models is those used to write software code. This is where sort of my expertise is meeting this area very quickly. There's a tool called Copilot, which is published by a company called GitHub, now owned by Microsoft. GitHub, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the #1 open source repository in the world. So if you want to look for open source code, that's where you look for it. And if you want to publish open source code, that's probably where you publish it. And GitHub has released this tool that helps people write software. So you can start writing a program and the tool will fill it in for you, what it thinks you want to do. Or you can say, write me a bubble sort, and it will write a bubble sort. So it's helping humans create code much, much faster. And then what else? The other thing that is, and ChatGPT is also pretty good at writing code. And you can read about that on the media as well. But this stuff is coming in all areas. Like there's some very interesting work being done in speech generation. So let's say you want narration for a video. We've all heard those kind of fakey sounding synthetic voices on YouTube videos and said, what the heck is this? You know, those are going to get so much better that you will not be able to distinguish them from real people very quickly. And that is also done using similar kinds of technology. So we've got all that in our world today, and what's coming on the horizon is these things are going to get cheaper and easier to create as the technology hurdles forward. As I mentioned today, most of these models are created by large companies with lots of money and resources to create them, but even maybe 6 months or a year from now, that is not going to be the case. So they're going to be everywhere, and they're going to be generating all the stuff, the kinds of things that humans have generated in the past. And we're going to be struggling with the legal issues that come out of that. Well, we're already struggling with them today because there have been some lawsuits filed already. So that's where we are right now.
You know, it's amazing because what this means for, let's say, for ADR professionals, is that we can probably use this generative AI to write our profile, start writing our marketing campaign. We can even generate deepfake videos, us addressing large crowd in Bali, Indonesia. We can do a lot of things, but in fact, actually, I'm teaching technology licensing at Santa Clara Law School with a lot of help from Heather, who used to teach at UC Hastings. But one of the things that I had to tell the students, because I was concerned with the ChatGPT, is that right before I handed out the exams, I told them that I don't live under a rock. I know such thing as a ChatGPT exists. I have, in fact, run through my exam questions through ChatGPT. I lie, only I did it on one of the questions, not all of it. And I kept the answer. So, and I also, there's such thing as a zero ChatGPT, which checked whether the answer was created by GPT. So, capiche? So that's what I had to tell my student. But Colin, you are self-described nerd. You are a lover of all things technology. So what are some of the cool things that people can do using generative AI, such as Stable Diffusion and ChatGPT, from your perspective?
Well, in terms of cool applications, I think the mind reels. I kind of want to just sit back and listen to Heather talk because she's so wise about all of these topics. But it's interesting, Ken, I'm going to be teaching at Santa Clara myself next weekend. And part of me feels saying to these law students, you know, hey, if you use ChatGPT, you're going to be in trouble. That's at odds with where all of this is going. I mean, as Heather says, I think these large language models are going to become part of the fabric. And we've already seen Microsoft embrace this wholly in terms of putting it into Bing. You know, now if you have Edge, you've got ChatGPT-4 or a model thereof right in the upper right-hand corner of your browser. We're starting to see you know, the use of large language models in a wide variety of different contexts. So if we say to our students, hey, don't use these things, it's a little bit like my 6th grade math professor when he was trying to teach me long division. And I said, well, I have a calculator here on my watch. And he said, no, don't use that calculator on your watch. I'll fail you if you do that. You have to learn how to do it by hand. And I would say, yeah, but when am I not going to have this calculator on my watch? I think the reality is, you know, a lot of lawyers that I speak to and mediators and arbitrators, you know, they're very worried that these technologies are going to replace them. And I will say in the ODR field, we don't talk about artificial intelligence as much as we talk about the fourth party. So if you think about party 1 and party 2 as the disputants and the human neutral, the mediator, the arbitrator is party 3, technology is the fourth party. And the question is, what do we ask the fourth party to do? Now, 20 years ago, we didn't ask the fourth party to do much, but now the fourth party, it manages our calendars, it searches our documents, it sends out our reminders when we have a video call coming up. Even Zoom could be considered an aspect of the fourth party. And now we see a majority of mediations are convening virtually. So the question is now, what's the fourth party going to do tomorrow, especially now that it's powered by these large language models? And there was a keynote at the recent ABA Tech Show where the speaker said something that I like. They said, look, AI is not going to replace us. AI is going to turn us into superheroes. We're going to be able to do things in a weekend that used to take a month or even a year. It may be that our students are going to be able to generate videos and generate essays that are hundreds of pages long and in a very short period of time. Now, our job is going to change because instead of sitting down at the keyboard and typing out each word, we're going to have to become what's now called affectionately in Silicon Valley prompt engineers, because these AIs are a little bit like magic lamps with genies inside. But the genie doesn't do anything unless you wish. And I don't know if any of you read The Monkey's Paw. If you make a bad wish, you can get some bad outcomes. So a lot of what we have to get good at is partnering with these new AI tools and getting very good at being explicit about what it is that we want them to do. And when they generate content, which may have hallucinations and misstatements of fact and misrepresentations and things like that, we have to get good at editing and revising our prompts to make sure that the things that these LLMs are generating are quality. And I think Heather did a great job laying out how these things operate. There's a lot of discussion now about what they call general AI. This notion of can we create a computer that is conscious and can sort of make its own decisions and evaluate things? I still think we're a good ways away from that. We have a lot of work to do before we get to that point. Really, what these large language models are is like, in Gmail, when you start typing a sentence and then it suggests the end of the sentence. Well, it's that on steroids, taken to a huge, where instead of just finishing your sentence, it can finish your whole email or maybe even finish your whole article. But all it's doing, as Heather mentions, it's just using these prediction rules, these correlations, these probabilities to predict what the next word should be in a sequence. So it's not like when you ask ChatGPT to write an essay on what is human consciousness, it's not thinking about it the way that a human thinks about it. It's just predicting based on these enormous amounts of correlation rules that it's gleaned from this training set what the best next word would be in the sequence. So I think we're going to have to get smart about how to utilize these things. If you look at companies like Harvey and like Case Text, they are working on how to deploy these large language models and train them on specific data sets so they can be useful in the legal context, for instance. So you would have an assistant as an associate, and you could write a brief, or you could take an enormous amount of documents and then synthesize those documents and create a summary. There's a lot of companies, as Heather mentions, that are working on using these tools and training them in specific verticals. And I think we in the dispute resolution field, we need to do that as well. We need to create training data sets, and we need to train our own versions of these LLMs on content that we think is appropriate and helpful in the dispute resolution context, so that these fourth parties that we're partnering with can be maximally useful for us and generate content that we think is high quality because it's based on a training set that embodies a lot of the core pearls of wisdom in our field. But it's going to be a very bumpy ride over the next few years as these things play out, especially because, as you mentioned, Ken, AI is not new, but the computing power that was required to make it work at this scale is now available. And we are, I think, mere years away from major expansions in computing power. If you look at things like quantum computing, you look at the expansions in the ability to store enormously large data sets. So, the growth of computing power is inexorable. And I think it will make these mechanisms that are staggeringly competent right now, over the next few years, they will become even more competent. So we got to get very smart about how to utilize these tools to achieve the objectives we have as lawyers and dispute resolvers.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about some of the issues that generative AI creates. We've been talking about how computing power made AI, generative AI possible, but it also requires a massive amount of data. So, Heather mentioned this. When you talk about stable diffusion or any kind of image generative AI, it uses millions, tens of millions of pictures, videos available on internet. And some copyright owners do not like that. In fact, I think there are several lawsuits already going on. Getty Image filed a lawsuit against Stability AI, saying the image generated by Stability AI uses some of Getty's images. And then there are, I think, some artists filed a lawsuit against Microsoft, GitHub, and OpenAI on basically similar grounds. So Heather, I know technology is new, case law hasn't really developed. Do you have any thoughts or opinion of how these IP issues is going to be decided?
I have a lot of thoughts. They're very opinionated thoughts. So the Getty stability case is pretty different from the other ones in some important ways. It's what I would call like a normal lawsuit. Like Getty, which owns a lot of images, has brought the lawsuit, and that is the kind of lawsuit that I would guess may be settled. By the way, I don't know anything about Stability's strategy on this, and I have not worked with them on it. This is, and nothing I say should be taken as on behalf of Stability. But the other lawsuits, the one about GitHub Copilot, which is a code generation AI, is a class action suit. And one of the lawsuits about artwork is a class action lawsuit. And the way those will be resolved will be, I think, quite different because those are going to be, I would guess, defended tooth and nail by the defendants and will not be settled, because in a way they can't afford to settle. It's too bad of a precedent to create, and with class actions, a lot of times the outcome is based more on class certification issues than substance, right? Mm-hmm. So the main legal issue that's going to come up, there will be many of them, but the main legal issue that is going to come up is probably going to be fair use under copyright law. So if you asked a lawyer before, the beginning of this year, what rights do you need in order to train a model on images or text? Almost every lawyer would respond, you don't need any licenses because it's fair use. And the reason that people said that, and I have told many clients that myself, is that the way that you're using the input data is very consistent with the fair use doctrine. And I won't, spend a lot of time talking about it, but it has 4 non-exclusive factors that include most notably what portion of the work you're using and whether the use is transformative. And the transformative element is these days in the jurisprudence probably the most important element. So it actually weighs very heavily towards fair use. And so most companies would have assumed that they actually didn't need any license in order to train on data, because as I said, that data does not end up in the model. It just informs the development of the model. Now, the class action regarding the images does allege copyright infringement. I hope I'm remembering properly, but the case against Copilot does not. And the reason we think, we don't know why the plaintiffs wrote the complaint the way they did, but the reason that people think that it did not allege copyright infringement is that in the case of Copilot, it was trained all on open source code. And that means that there was a license to do the training, right? Because all open source licenses would grant rights sufficient to do the training, even if you didn't have a fair use argument. So, but I think most lawyers would say you don't need any license at all because it's fair use. But a great deal of the content out there on the internet is under either open source software licenses or so-called, free culture licenses like Creative Commons that actually grant broad rights to use the material. What those licenses generally require is that you provide a license notice if you redistribute the material. But the key here is whether the model is actually a derivative work or redistribution of the original material. And you can tell from the way I describe the technology, I don't think it is. And I'd say probably most lawyers don't think it is, but there are definitely some people who are taking the opposing view. In fact, if you read the complaint, the class action complaint regarding the artwork, it calls the models a 21st century cut and paste tool or collage tool. And that's really not what it is. but that is the conception of how this works that is leading people to claim that it's copyright infringement. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. So Heather, when I spoke with you and learned about Stable Diffusion, one thing that I was really alarmed was that its use to create deepfakes in social media and Metaverse. And I immediately thought about Avatar because those of you who play in the Metaverse world, a lot of you appear as an avatar. And it used to be that it will require a professional equipment and maybe a month of work to create a photorealistic avatar of yourself. So I was excited that with this new technology that, hey, people will have the resources to create their own photorealistic avatar. But then I was thinking, hang on a second, that means that anybody can create. Nowadays, supposedly it takes about 6 photos and iPhone to create photorealistic avatar. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it just points out that it has become increasingly easy to create somebody's face or somebody's video. And what does that mean if somebody else can actually hijack your image on avatars or social media? In fact, we have the example of Zelensky, president of Ukraine, telling his troops to surrender that made around right after Russian invasion of Ukraine. Turned out to be, it was a deep fake video. President Zelensky never made a statement, but a lot of people were confused. And that's one example of this type of technology being used to create confusion and alter the reality. So, Colin, as an ADR professional, professionals that we are, how can you help with the possible loss of reality? I mean, this is serious because let's take social security number. I think most people are concerned with somebody hijacking your social security number. But did you know that you can get actually new social security number issued to you if you can prove that you are a victim of such hijacking? But if your face is hijacked, where is the redress? So, Colin, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, it's a great question, Ken. The division I worked at eBay and PayPal was called Trust and Safety, and we dealt a lot with fraud and we dealt a lot with identity crimes. I think a lot of these challenges are not new. I think AI creates new wrinkles. We had a huge issue at eBay with people logging in pretending to be people that they weren't. And there are lots of ways that you can do that, short of copying someone's face or getting their biometric data. And we had to spend a lot of time. It was an arms race with the bad guys who were using some of these tools to spoof our site because they were trying to steal money from unsuspecting other users. I think what we've seen is a lot of the tools that we've put in place to prevent that kind of fraud and spoofing now are not effective because people are deploying these AI tools against them. So many of you have had like a CAPTCHA appear on a website where you have to identify different pictures. Which of these are buses? Which of these are traffic lights? Well, those work pretty well because computers weren't really smart enough to fill those out. Well, now the bad guys, and when we say bad guys, it's not just kind of 13-year-olds in their basement. I mean, there are people who go to work every day in suits and high rises with PhDs in computer science. Their job is defrauding people, and they can utilize these tools, and they can do pretty good at figuring out some of those CAPTCHAs. So the other thing is, as computing power gets more powerful, some of the things that used to be uncrackable encryption mechanisms suddenly become vulnerable again. So we are going to have to, it's, as I say, technology is always a moving target, and we're going to have to figure out ways to combat this. Now, if you saw Sam Altman present to Congress earlier this week, pretty much the AI industry is saying, please regulate us, because I think they understand how damaging some of this technology could be. If we have a news network that's just showing deepfakes all day and nobody can tell the truth from the made up stuff, we could be in big trouble as a society, because if we don't have some common ground of, this is what the facts are, democracy could easily spin out of control. So we're going to need to figure out how to ensure that these tools are not used for malevolent purposes. I was on a call last week with the New York State Bar, and an expert was talking about watermarking, which is something that happens with a lot of images now. There's ways that you can essentially invisibly mark generated images so that their provenance. And that may be something that we need to do, is regulate some of the large AI image generators or even deepfake video. Now, there's always going to be bad guys out there that are using tools that are kind of created on the black market, and maybe don't include that kind of watermarking. But Ken, that zero GPT that a lot of professors are using, it's not very accurate. It doesn't do a very good job because, as we say, everything generated by ChatGPT is new each time. So it's hard to tell human generated product from AI generated product. But if there was a way to put in a watermark that would allow us to identify that, maybe we could start to put some systems in place. But I do think, I am excited by the potential of these tools. I think the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. When new technologies are generated, there's often a Wild West period, but eventually we figure out how to civilize them and then harbor their potential, harness their potential for human good, social good. And I think that AI is going to be, over time, a huge force for human good. David was just asking a question about, is this going to replace us? Well, 50% of people on the planet don't have meaningful access to a justice system. And there's really no way with our current human-powered model to extend the system to those individuals. And maybe technology will create an opportunity to expand access to fast and fair redress and expand the reach of justice. But we are going to have to put very strong guardrails in place. And we're going to have to audit the use of these technologies and monitor them and regulate them so as to ensure that the bad actors over time are disincentivized from utilizing the technology in malevolent ways, and then the applications that generate social good and work within our value system are accentuated. But it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take a while to do it because it's a moving target, as I say. But this is not a new challenge. I think this has been a challenge all the way along as the internet has expanded.
Back in 90s and 2000, I remember that we had huge issue with the domain name. And eventually we have come up with a domain name dispute system that utilize essentially arbitration to resolve those disputes. Does either one of you see that kind of international arbitration system being utilized to help any dispute in this area?
I'll
thank you, Heather. I will say, as an ODR guy, definitely yes. I see online dispute resolution being essential for the future of the internet. I think we are creating a new society in the virtual space. And every human society throughout history has had to have a way to resolve its disputes in a fast and fair manner. So we need to build a justice system that works the way the internet works. And I think all of the disputes that are going to be arising out of the use of these technologies, we have to provide redress. And I think ODR is the best way to do that. I just don't think the courts are structured in a way, they're too tied to geography, they move too slowly. So I do think that that is coming. I think that the disputes around copyright in especially the image generation space, I think that this is a window where we're going to have some of those cases. But what we're starting to see is, the future AIs will be trained not on human taken images, they'll be trained on images generated by other AIs. So very quickly, I think we're not going to get to a point. I mean, obviously, we know the case where Getty, if you go into Stable Diffusion and say, generate a picture of a soccer player from Getty Images, it will reproduce actually the Getty Images logo in the lower right-hand corner or some facsimile thereof. Very soon, after a generation or two, once the AIs are training themselves, I think it's going to be very hard to get back to here is an actual image that is generated that came from someone's camera. But I think there are going to be a lot of those issues now because these new AI mechanisms have kicked up dust. So we'll have to resolve those cases, and I think arbitration might be a good way to do it, particularly because it's not tied to geography. But Heather is more of an expert on that than me.
So I'm not a litigator, so consider the source, but taking a little bit of a possibly contrarian view, like what if you could basically get rid of discovery disputes by having AIs do most of the discovery, or get rid of certain kinds of elements of the legal process by having that are perhaps, don't require as much human judgment. I mean, there are a lot of lawyers today who spend a lot of time doing stuff that maybe they don't need to be doing, that could probably be done by AI. And in fact, with respect to discovery, that's already, happening. So I actually see that as kind of a positive in the process, because I think the general effect of AI will be that humans will not stop doing things, we'll just do different things. By the way, the other thing I would say about the deepfakes and social impact of that, I don't know about you, but I already take a lot of what I see characterized as news on the internet as with a grain of salt. I mean, I don't, there are lots of sources I don't even look at because I don't trust them and they're just clickbait, and I don't need them in my life. But I think that that's just going to become, there's going to be more of that, but I actually see that as an opportunity. And the opportunity is that once upon a time, people went to, say, news sources because they trusted them. Now people have become kind of grazers and looking at all sorts of news sources, from search engines and whatnot. But we may go back to more of a situation where people consume information because of the source of it, and the people who are in the business of authenticating information will gain more of an upper hand. So I see that as a big business opportunity to authenticate information, and it may actually have some positive effects about the media that we consume, because while certainly there will be a lot of stuff out there that is not real, people are now going to be more and more focused on what is real, because very quickly they're going to learn that they can't just trust anything they see.
Well, that's a fascinating point, and we're going to end on that point because we're just about out of time. This has been a truly stimulating and mind-bending discussion of all these technologies, how we're going to use them, and a little glimpse into what the future has to hold. Heather and Ken and Colin, thank you all very much for taking the time and putting so much thought into this presentation for us. We urge everyone to contribute to a food bank of their choice if they liked what they saw. If you do contribute to a food bank in honor of our great speakers, please let us know, either Natalie or myself or Jean Lawler, and we'll add it to our running total, and perhaps we can make these three great speakers the answer to that pub trivia question, which will last forever and ever. Who were the speakers who put the Will Work for Food project over $400,000 in audience contributions to food banks? So thank you all very much. We look forward to seeing you again next week. And with that, we are complete.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you all.